Good evening or good morning wherever you are in the world. I'm Samantha Joseph and I'm moderating the 10th Google Hangout session of the 4th fall edition of our Read for Pixels campaign. Through Read for Pixels, the Pixel Project is collaborating with 12 award-winning best-selling authors to raise awareness about violence against women and to raise funds towards the Celebrity Male Role Model Pixel Reveal campaign, which aims to raise $1 million for the Pixel Project to keep their efforts to end violence against women alive and kicking. We'll be telling you more about the Read for Pixels fundraiser, which has lots and lots of exclusive author goodies a little later in this session. And you can find out more about the Pixel Project at www.thepixelproject.net. So today we have a very special guest, a live discussion and Q&A session with the amazingly talented novelist and comic book writer Genevieve Valentine. Genevieve is the author of Persona and of the critically acclaimed novel Mechanic, A Tale of the Circus Tresolti, which won the Crawford Award for Best Novel, as well as a nomination for the Nebula Award and the Romantic Times Best Fantasy of the Year. Her short fiction has been nominated for a World Fantasy Award and the Shirley Jackson Award. Genevieve has also generously donated a few lovely book bundles to the stash of author goodies we have up as perks for donors at the Read for Pixels fundraising campaign. So the first book bundle is the Persona book bundle, which has one Persona hardback signed and personalized, one Icon hardback signed and personalized, and one short story anthology featuring Genevieve's story, signed and personalized. There are 3 of these bundles. Another bundle is the Genevieve Valentine book bundle. It's one Mechanic paperback signed and personalized, one Girls at the Kingfishers Club paperback signed and personalized, one Bloody Fabulous, an anthology of short stories featuring a story from Genevieve alongside stories from Holly Black, Kelly Link, and more, also signed and personalized. And there are 3 of these bundles. And then we have the Catwoman comic book bundle, which consists of 2 Catwoman trade paperbacks, collections number 6 and 7, signed and personalized, and 1 Strange Sports Stories from Vertigo, also signed and personalized. So there's only 1 of the Catwoman bundle, and all of these bundles are available for donors in the US only, sadly. So far, we've crossed the $4,000 milestone and are on our way to our $5,000 fundraising goal. So please give generously to help us. All our funds go towards the Pixel Project Celebrity Male Role Model Pixel Reveal campaign to help end violence against women. So I think that I've talked enough, and now I'll pass it on to Genevieve, who will be reading from an excerpt from The Girls at the Kingfisher Club. So Genevieve, I'm passing it on to you. Hello.
Hi. Thank you everybody for tuning in wherever you are, whenever you're tuning in. I'm going to start with a brief reading from The Girls at the Kingfisher Club. It's 2 separate scenes, but you'll see why they go together. By 1927, there were 12 girls who danced all night and never gave names, but by then the men had given up asking and called them all Princess. Hey, Princess, dust off your shoes, it's a Charleston! The men would have called them anything they wanted to be called, Dollface or Queenie or Beloved, just to get one girl on the dance floor for a song. But in that flurry of short dresses and spangles and ribbon-tied shoes, Princess was the name that suited. It seemed magical enough, like maybe it was true. Wild things, these girls. Wild for dancing. They could go all night without sitting, grabbing at champagne between songs, running to the throng at the table and saying something that made them all laugh, light and low together like the parts of a chorus. It wasn't right, all those women sticking together so close. Something about the wall of bob-haired girls scared the men, though they hardly knew it. They just knew they'd better dance their best with the princess, and no mistake. No need to worry, though, as long as a man could dance. The nights were long, and drink was cheap, and sometimes the princess's smiles were red-lipped and happy and not sharp, white, flashing teeth. And there were so many that if one turned down a dance, it was easy to wait and try again with another one. Princess, pass me a waltz? Some men never noticed their full numbers. It was hardly fair to even ask a man to count. There were 2 pairs of twins, or 3, hard to say. It was easy to get confused. They moved in little packs, 2 and 3 at a time, and it was tough to keep track. Some men thought there were only 10 or 9. Boys just out from under their mother's noses saw only the one they loved in the crowd. The older men understood how that mistake could happen. Hair, one had bright green eyes, one's had a swan's neck. Together they were intoxicating. But there was no point. The girls were wild for dancing and nothing else. No hearts beat underneath those thin, bright dresses. They laughed like glass. The coldest one looked like someone had dragged a statue out for the night, as if she would scratch out your eyes if you so much as looked at her sideways. No man was fool enough to ask her to dance. No reason to die young when there were 11 others. There were willing sisters who smelled like 4711 or Shalimar or smoke. Always some sweet ones who closed their eyes and revealed dark pencil along their lashes, who laughed when a partner swung them around, who grinned and touched a man's shoe with her own when they tapped back and forth. No need to worry about battle axes when a man had a girl who could light up the floor. No need to worry about loving one when all of them would be back tomorrow night. No need for names at all, so long as when a fellow called her princess, she said yes. Turned out it was just as well not knowing, once the newspaper men came asking. The Hamilton sisters entered the Marquee together. It was bigger and better appointed than the Kingfisher. The staircase could accommodate all 12 of them in stocking feet, their shoes dangling from their hands. Without knowing they'd be going someplace new, all the sisters still must have sensed that the beautiful times could end any night. They dressed like it was New Year's Eve in a movie, the last night they'd ever have. The effect of all 12 of them standing on the stairs was striking enough that the room paused as the crowd caught sight of them, and even the musicians dropped the volume for a beat, as if the wind had been knocked out of them from 12 girls with glittering, dance-hungry eyes appearing all at once. Jo was the most subdued, in a fawn dress bordered with purple beads. It was the nicest she had. She hadn't worn it in years, and it was too long for the fashion, but she felt more comfortable with knees covered. She held her shoes in one hand, her grip white-knuckled around the heels. Behind her came Hattie and Maddie with headbands of tight-pressed feathers over their caps of dark hair, each in a gray dress spangled in silver and carrying matching pairs of silver shoes. Sophie, Araminta, and Rebecca came next, their chins up like the three graces. Rebecca in gold, Sophie in green, her blonde hair curled. Araminta's long neck was wrapped in the pale green beads, and her white dress fell nearly as long as Jo's. Rose was in red, Lily in black with a necklace of paste pearls. Doris's dress had a black hip sash that hugged the ragged edges where it had been cobbled together from two others. Violet was in a simple dress the color of an orchid. Ella wore pale blue and looked like spring. Last was Lou in a copper dress, her shoes hanging around her neck, fastened by their ribbon ties like a pair of rabbits from a hunting expedition, and she had her cigarette holder already clamped in her teeth. The Charleston picked up seamlessly, good musicians are hard to rattle, and the bouncer closed the door behind them, dropping the room back into false twilight. Still, the crowd seemed to hang back from the stairs, waiting for them to burst into song or pull out revolvers or throw their shoes at the unsuspecting. Jo was already scanning the crowd, looking for Tom, dreading it. He was a consummate host, at least. 2 breaths after she'd started looking, he was already out of the shadows and moving through the crowd to meet them, wearing a slightly odd expression at the pile-up on his stairs. "Ladies," he said, including them all with the word, "welcome to the Marquee." "I didn't know you were coming," he glanced at Jo, "so there's nothing reserved for you tonight, but I'll get you settled in with something that I hope will be all right, and then we'll see about drinks. You must be thirsty. Henry at the bar will be happy to help you." Hattie and Maddie moved to keep pace with him, and the others followed. Jo hung back and let them go. Rebecca called it sheep counting, and it wasn't far off, but it wasn't hard to lose one in the shuffle. Best to make sure everyone was safe inside before they scattered. Once the sisters hit the dance floor, all bets were off. Lou was last, and she stopped next to Jo long enough to pluck her cigarette holder out of her mouth. "You're the nicest people in the clink, Jo. I should have figured something was up. Were you planning to hit the road with him in your fancy frock after the party?" "Oh, I don't think he'd look very good in my fancy frock," said Jo, and moved to catch up with the rest. There were 2 empty tables on a mezzanine just off the dance floor, and with the materialization of a few extra chairs, there was enough space for them all. Within seconds, the younger girls had strapped on their shoes. Before the older girls even had a chance to fasten their buckles, the first tray of champagne was being delivered. Henry, the young man behind the bar, whom Tom had pointed out, had bleached out his hair stone white, and when he looked over, Jo watched his pale head pause, counting them, twice. The Marquee was a sharper establishment than the Kingfisher. Besides the waiters moving back and forth behind the bar, the wood floor was polished and the red curtains newly made. It was half again as large as any other place they'd been, except maybe Salon Renault. Joe guessed that Tom's deal with the police meant he could afford to spread out a little. The space allowed for tables and chairs tucked off the dance floor in front of the mezzanine where a stray kick could knock a glass off the table into someone's waiting arms. That was another good sign. You had to trust your clientele to arrange things this way. There'd be decent dancing here. There were already 200 people milling around, maybe more. Joe wondered how they ever heard of a place like this when there wasn't even a street number to mark it, when you had to count stoops and knock on a plain red door and say curtain up to the man who answered before you could go through the second door and down the stairs into the dance hall. It felt like a place she would have liked to know about a long time ago. From beside her, Tom said, "Penny for your thoughts." She thought Tom had a bad habit of standing too close to her. She had a bad habit of letting him. "It's lovely," she said instead. "How long have you had it, did you say?" It was strange, thinking he'd been so close to her for so long. He shrugged. "I've had it almost 2 years, but it hasn't been open long. I had the deed, but I had to shake a lot of hands before I had the safety to open up shop, and then I had to get up the nerve to open it and declare myself a businessman." Joe remembered 1 or 2 nights when Tom had shown up with his hands shaking and his face drawn and had pulled her onto the dance floor without a word, as if he was afraid that if he opened his mouth, he'd tell her what had happened and frighten them both. Whatever it was he'd been hiding, Joe suspected he had been paying for it for the last 8 years. A waltz was playing, and most of the girls were out on the floor with blissful-looking men who held them as if they were porcelain. Sophie and Lily were dancing together, and Doris was waiting it out at the bar, laughing with the bartender and casually spinning a highball glass that had appeared in. Satisfied, a smile flickering over his face. She knew that expression.
Okay. Thank you so much, Genevieve.
My pleasure.
I really love that book, actually. And our first question is going to be about the girls at the Kingfisher Club.
Okay.
Okay. So, Josephine, the eldest among the 12 sisters in the girls at the Kingfisher Club, does her best in an abusive situation. We can recognize in her actions those of many survivors. She is one of the strongest characters I've read, yet she has no superpowers and wields no weapons. So what inspired you to create Josephine, and why did you choose to focus on a female protagonist in an abusive situation?
I've always been fascinated by the original fairy tale, which would read like a horror story if the narrator realized what was going on. Obviously, it's from a time when it was not nearly the red flag it is now to lock in your daughters at night to make sure they don't go anywhere that you don't know about it. But the original story was always framed in a way that even as a child, I thought was hypnotic, but telling in a way that I couldn't put into words until later. It was more or less a whodunit, and the hero of the story was the young man who figures out their secret. It doesn't necessarily condemn the girls for going out to dance, but the realm is supernatural. The men have terrible intentions. It's sort of a sinister fairyland. And so the idea is that by finding out their secret and telling their father, he has freed them from this horrible enchantment where they go out tonight to dance. But in every version of the story that I had ever read, the princesses were having a perfectly good time. The story seems to want us to think that something terrible is happening because they're tired and their shoes are worn out and everything else. Nightlife. When I wanted to do a fairy tale retelling, it was probably the first story that came to mind because I had thought about it so much when I was younger. And I had read up enough on the 1920s to know that that was exactly where I wanted to put it, because it was right in that slice of time after World War I when a lot of women were suddenly pushing for independence in a way that I think American society had not necessarily seen before that. We were talking earlier about the fact that in 1902, 1903, we still had etiquette manuals about the fact that when you went to a dinner party, you were supposed to be seated just so, and hopefully if there was fresh fruit at the dinner, the gentleman next to you would offer to cut your pear in half for you, because obviously you would never want to eat a whole pear by yourself. And by 1922, you had women who were wearing dresses cut to the knee, going out at night, smoking and drinking. And it was a sea change, which was exhilarating for the women involved and terrifying for the previous generation. So I think what I wanted to do was sort of create the part of the water where the river meets the ocean, and for a while everything is confused and sort of silty and sand keeps getting churned up. It is entirely feasible that a father from the previous generation would not have expected to see his children very often, particularly if they were daughters. If you had the money, you sent them away to boarding school, or they had a governess. You were finished with them until it was time for them to sort of come out into society and start that process. By 1922 or 23, you had flapper magazines on the newsstand trumpeting the fact that we had the new woman who was completely independent. That tension across the entire culture was huge, and I wanted to take that tension and push it into the dynamic of a single family, where the father could genuinely think that he was not being as abusive as we know he is, because the norms for his era and the norms for the era in which these girls are living are so vastly different. In the original story, the oldest sister is not portrayed particularly well. There are several versions of the story in which the young soldier who discovers their secret doesn't want to marry her at all because he thinks that she's overbearing, and instead he goes for the youngest daughter. This daughter, it's because he wants to inherit the kingdom, and he figures that the oldest daughter is his best shot to do that. And I sort of took that personally. I thought someone who would put so much work into keeping everything together and arranging the logistics of what was literally a supernatural trip. Like, these girls basically go under her bed into Narnia every night in the original story. I was impressed. As a child, I was impressed, and as I grew up, I became even more impressed by the idea of a sister who sort of took up a role that was not maternal, but was still trying to do the best she could for all of these sisters who were her responsibility. And unfortunately, it's sort of all too easy to imagine that there is a father who expects complete obedience, and the moment that doesn't happen, there are problems.
That's true. Let's talk about the sisters. So there are 12 sisters in the book, and you have portrayed each of them as distinct individuals. This is in stark contrast to a boys' book, where female supporting characters seem to be sort of interchangeable. So how did you accomplish that feat?
I mean, the thing is, I don't think of it as a feat. I think of it as the fact that I have never met two women who were exactly alike. It's just a fundamental understanding that you are writing individuals, and every individual is going to end up a slightly different person. I think you end up with interchangeable supporting characters when the people who are writing whatever the marginalized character is that we're discussing at the time, to fill the purpose of the plot rather than to let the characters inform the story. And I think that as long as you're trying to write characters who are whole people and who aren't so perfect that they disappear and aren't so wretched that that's all that we register of them is how terrible they are, and put them together and try to think about how they would interact with each other, you end up with, sort of by default, a more interesting collection of things than if people just show up to serve a plot purpose and then vanish.
That goes on to directly to the next question, which is about genre stereotypes. So how do you personally work around genre stereotypes to create complex female characters who have their own agency and are dealing with the world around her, which includes situations that involve sexism, misogyny, and violence against women and girls. How do you avoid gender stereotypes?
That's an excellent question. I guess my first question is defining the genre, because technically Girls of the Kingfisher Club is not a fantasy novel, it's a historical novel.
Mm-hmm.
And in that case, I think that the main goal is to avoid creating a character who is wholly abusive just for the sake of bringing abuse into the story. And really thinks of themselves as an abuser. Like, very few people who have gone on the record about being abusive woke up in the morning like, I cannot wait to be abusive today. Like, today is the day. They all wake up and think, I can't believe the world is against me. Like, why, why can't things go my way? And that just becomes unhealthy and poisoned to the point of lashing out. And then you get controlling behavior, you get anger issues, you get sort of rampant sexism, you get all of those things. But those things don't come from monsters, they come from people. And to some degree, that makes it more unfortunate. It's much easier to imagine that there are people who are just monstrous. My experience with abusive dynamics is that that's not how it goes. Like, it's not as simple as that ever. And one of the reasons that it's so hard to deal with abusive dynamics and abusive people is because they are still people. So in terms of stereotypes, you want to avoid woobifying? You want to avoid woobifying abusive behavior. But abuse doesn't come from two-dimensional Marvel villains who like show up on an alien pod and decide they're going to take over the world. Abuse comes from people who might not realize what they are doing, people who know what they're doing and are getting away with it. And it's changing them as people. It's something I thought a lot about when I was writing the book. I had some people ask me about the father figure, some people who thought he was too awful, and some people who thought that he wasn't awful enough. And I've thought about that a lot. Especially the people who thought he wasn't abusive enough, that it didn't count as abuse unless he was hitting them at every second. But again, like, my experience is that's not always what abuse is. Abuse is just someone who does not take your humanity into account. And I think that, again, if you take the idea of a character as a person who has a bunch of conflicting impulses, who's coming up against a character who has a bunch of conflicting impulses, you're going to end up by nature with something that isn't a stereotype, because you're dealing with two people and not two statements.
For context, for people out there who are viewing, in the Girls at the Kingfisher Club, Josephine and her sisters face not only emotional abuse, but financial abuse by their father as well. So this brings us to our next question. So the withholding of finances is a form of abuse not often talked about. So when people, like you mentioned just now, when people think about domestic violence and other forms of violence against women, they think about physical abuse. Why did you choose to focus on emotional and financial abuse, which are considered hidden aspects of domestic violence?
Specifically because historically it made sense because, I used to have this year on lock, but until year X, 18 mumble, women could not own property. Like, there were very specific circumstances under which women were capable of handling their own finances, and otherwise their finances were handled by a male relative or their husband. And Mr. Hamilton, their father, is from this era, and it never occurs to him to give the girls more than the pocket money that he decides they deserve, because that is how it was. Meanwhile, around them, the world is moving on. After World War I, there was a job market for women that had not been available before that. And part of the reason that the image of the flapper was so scary to so many people, and there were full issues of satirical magazines like Punch that were devoted to suffragettes, sort of in the World War I era, and then after that, flappers, because these were women who were declaring that they deserved to be autonomous people with independence and the vote, and by implication, the ability to earn their own money and not be beholden. The reason that that was so threatening is fairly obvious. And the idea that these girls were not being mistreated by the standards of their father, but obviously being mistreated by the standards of someone who considers women autonomous people, was something that I really wanted to show. Like, I really wanted to go through all the catalogs, and I really wanted to see what we were talking about and what it would mean for Rebecca to be able to have savings when they were getting a pittance for all of this, what it means when they're able to pay a cab to go out for the night, what it means that in an emergency they can't get a cab home. In the book, there's more than one scene in which the girls have to make a quick getaway out of a terrible situation. And the idea of being completely without money is one of the things that makes that situation so horrific. It's not just the momentary panic. It's not just whatever prompted it. It's the fact that with this financial withholding, without having a way to earn one's own money, you're not free. Like, yeah, that one is also close to my heart. Like, that one is something that I think can become controlling behavior without people thinking about it. Up until, what was it, 1974 or something like that, women couldn't apply for credit cards without the signature of a male relative.
Wow.
When the Handmaid's Tale TV show came out earlier this year, people were talking about that. So until 1974, a woman couldn't have a line of credit. She had whatever cash she had on her, and that was it. And if she wanted to leave, that was what she had. And so a lot of what I wanted to address is sort of things that made sense historically that are not as far in the past as we might want to think.
You do a lot of research for your books. A lot. So, what kind of research did you do so that you would portray this aspect of domestic violence accurately, especially in that era?
So the answer is I did a lot, but I also have terrible short and midterm memory. So we're going to have to skim over a lot of it. I did a lot of research into generally what the speakeasy scene looked like, what was feasible for young women in terms of what they could get through a catalog, how much it would cost, the general allowance for someone of his financial situation who was sort of parsimonious, not necessarily to be cruel, but definitely deliberately. Mm-hmm. So there was financial, I did a lot of research into the available job market. I did research into boarding houses. I did research into the garment district in New York at that time. And I did some research into the criminality of speakeasy culture, which was fascinating because, like a lot of cultures that operate sort of outside the law, there's as much brutality as you could possibly imagine. Mm-hmm. But there is also always something interesting and weird in this underworld. So there was a Canadian alcohol company that was trying to smuggle things into the United States. And they invented a code so sophisticated that the US government had to actually hire a woman who was, at the time, researching whether or not Francis Bacon had put codes in Shakespeare's plays, which he would also have written.
Wow.
And she had to invent a system of cracking all of these codes and figure out the entire smuggling operation. And she basically created the Coast Guard's code breaking, which would eventually lead into like World War II and the Enigma and all of that kind of stuff. And there were women who ran speakeasies, one of whom had gotten arrested something like 60 times.
Wow.
She just, every time she posted bail, she wore a giant necklace with all these locks on it to show that like you couldn't keep her out. So it's very fascinating to see what happens on the fringes, because it's always more fantastic than anything I could have imagined. Like, I couldn't imagine a woman who actually has a necklace to like put on as she gets out of prison for the 80th time or whatever. And part of the trick is not putting it all in the book. Because if I was trying to put that all in the book, I would end up with like an 1,800-page novel. I use it to determine what is likely, what is possible, what can ring true.
You mentioned earlier that some people said that Josephine's father was, some said that he wasn't abusive enough, and some said that he was too abusive. So what methods did you employ to sort of ensure that readers were able to grasp the damage of the subtle forms of abuse, of financial abuse and emotional abuse, and realize how much they affect people?
By making it Josephine's story. It is horrible to Josephine and her sisters. It horrifies Josephine and her sisters. He has trapped Josephine and her sisters. At the beginning of the novel, I think that in general, he is a man with no complaints, but whether or not he has complaints is not the point. The effect of his behavior is the point. So, because we see it through Josephine's eyes, I think it's, well, I hope it's easy to grasp the fact that things that their father does not think of as abuse are still abusive behaviors.
You can feel how trapped the siblings feel living in that house. How did you manage to portray such a realistic sibling relationship and the dynamics between them under the desperate circumstances that the sisters are battling?
This is gonna be terrible, because the answer is I am not an only child, and I can go about 6 hours in a car with my sister before the first fight starts. And so extrapolating that with 11 sisters for years gets you part of the way there. And then the rest of it is thinking of it as a boarding school where there is no mother figure to speak of. There is essentially a punitive headmaster downstairs, and you are left to create your own microcosm. And whether or not that's functional is up to how much everybody there is determined to make it functional or not. One of the things that I definitely did not want was the idea that everything was fine all the time. It was important to me that it grated, but it was also important to me that for them it was more or less the norm. That if they were ever separated, they would miss each other, because you get used to living in whatever quarters you have. And they are fairly close. They have been through all of this together, and they've been through it as a unit. So it's purgatory. It's a place that's as good as you make it.
Okay. That's all for the questions on the girls at the Kingfisher Club. Let's move on to Persona and Icon.
Okay.
Your other books. So in Persona and Icon, which some folks on Goodreads have called fashion punk, you deal with the idea of faces of nations and the idea of pageantry. So your protagonist, Suyana Sapaki, is the face of a small, not particularly important nation. But she's intelligent enough to know that only as a face can she change anything. But she still riles against the limitations and distrust that comes with being a face. So at one point, when she's with her more famous partner in Icon, I think, Suyana thinks to herself, no one will remember me except as a pair of earrings and high heels covered in mud. So through Suyana, are you consciously exploring the day-to-day pageantry of women's objectification, or is it an organic part of your storytelling?
That's definitely a deliberate part of what this story is about. Persona and Icon are sort of about weaponizing the idea of young women. We weaponize them anyway from everything, for everything from school dress codes that only seem to ever apply to girls, to red carpets where women are expected to have a team of 15 people getting them dressed appropriately, and they're still subjected to how good do they look. while men are allowed to show up in just a suit, and as long as it's not a complete disaster, they get away scot-free. So there's definitely some of that double standard that I wanted to explore. And that's tied up a lot in celebrity culture, but there also is an everyday aspect of that. There is no neutral way for a woman to dress, for a girl to dress. Like, it doesn't exist. And it's a preoccupation that shouldn't be there, and it can be a giant burden, but I wanted Suyana to be someone who understood how to turn that back on the people who were trying to judge her by it and use that as one of the weapons in her arsenal to get what she wants.
So faces are considered to do a good job when they are pleasing and listen to their handlers. Do you think that women are still expected to operate on a similar system in society? Why or why not? If you do think so, what do you think can be done to change it?
Oh boy. So the answer is obviously yes. What can be done to change it? A lot can be done to change it. A lot of people are trying to change it. The number one thing that has to be done to change it is for men to understand that women do not exist as a reaction to them one way or the other. I think that's one of the biggest ones. Sort of the assumption that men are the default and then women either listen or don't listen, when what's actually happening is two people have two different ideas and have to hash it out, have to do whatever else. In Persona and Icon, Magnus very, very deliberately, I hope. It's always so weird to talk about your writing as if you've actually done the thing that you set out to do, because that's not something that I can decide, I feel like. Like, the author can't decide if they succeeded at the thing. What I was trying to do is sort of explore the idea of someone who genuinely is acting in the best interests of what a face from the UARC would need to do to sort of stay under the radar and do the best that she can. One of the things that causes friction between him and Suyana is the fact that Suyana is not necessarily interested in what is best for staying under the radar, because she has her own agenda. I'm trying not to spoil anything. Because she has her own agenda that he knows nothing about. Which often puts them at loggerheads, but I definitely did not want Magnus to come off as someone who looked at her as only someone who should do as she was told or else. Mm-hmm. Like, he's a smart enough guy that he realizes when she opts not to do something, or sometimes when she opts to go along with it, there is something else going on. He is not necessarily the reason that any of that is happening. So I think that the idea of handlers partially is just celebrity culture. There are a ton of male celebrities who have a bunch of handlers that are desperately hoping they never say the bad thing. But specifically, I think there is a dynamic that I wanted to talk about in Persona and Icon, mm-hmm. where it is assumed that women do better in general if there is a guy behind the scenes making it happen. Mm-hmm. And hopefully to point out that that's not necessarily the case.
Both Persona and Icon seem to target celebrity culture specifically in terms of its sexism. Is there anything that you want to comment about
that? Right before Icon came out, and again, trying not to spoil anything, but a lot of Icon is about a contractual romantic relationship that exists 90% for the cameras. There is a relationship behind the scenes, and that was part of the contract, but the point is of a relationship because it is good publicity. And right before Icon came out, that set of photos came out with Tom Hiddleston and Taylor Swift.
Yeah.
And those photos, probably the most awkward set of photos ever put on the internet, ever. And I think it took people about an hour to realize that they were taken on Taylor Swift's property. Like, she had a beach house and they were taken at the beach on the beach house. And we all know that Taylor Swift has so many security personnel that there is absolutely no way someone could have snuck on there without permission. So it was the careful manipulation of a completely fake relationship to look as if it was real and also being interrupted to make it feel more taboo that you were looking at the pictures. And as they were unrolling, I was just like that is the most one can hope from a photo shoot like this. Like, it was so artificial that it actually became kind of sublime. It was good stuff. People bought it for about 0.5 seconds, but it was like, for what it was the epitome of, we are looking at a photo shoot where someone has tipped off someone who gets their exclusive photos for a reason.
So sad. I felt very differently about Tom Hiddleston after that.
Tom Hiddleston wanted to be James Bond very much. He was doing what he could, and when the night manager could not get him all the way there, he was willing to listen to someone who said, what you should do is, and that person was not being a good handler for Tom Hiddleston at that time.
He needs a new handler.
I would be interested to see if he ever has a public relationship on a red carpet again. My guess is it's going to be a minimum of 5 years before he feels comfortable enough to try that again. Whether or not it's a real relationship, like, he's going to want to look single for a long time.
I agree with that. As an author, and especially in the science fiction and fantasy industry, it's not always easy to portray women in novels, or even to find them sometimes. And there's so many instances where women are stereotyped in SFF novels to act or be a certain way. But there's been an influx of capable female characters in the fantasy and young adult genres. So do you have any thoughts on this? And did this influence you when you created your female characters?
I think there have always been more interesting women characters than people seem to think. There tends to be a narrative of, recently we have a lot of strong female characters, and we definitely have a lot of them now, and they're getting mainstream press coverage, which I think is one of the big differences. So you're getting a narrative of, strong female characters are popular, which means that more people are looking for manuscripts to publish that have central female characters in them. But some of my favorite novels of the 70s and 80s, which in science fiction and the general narrative is considered a very doodly time, are Kenneth Lee novels, which are very often about women, always really complicated women, like really nice, well, I mean, not nice, which I guess is the point, but very, very chewy, complex characters. She did a YA trilogy in 1970 mumble, 1980 mumble, called the Unicorn Trilogy. And the heroine of that trilogy is sort of reluctant and bitter and petty and jealous and incredibly smart and capable of deep friendships and all of that kind of stuff. But through this incredible fantasy journey, she's holding it together, often by being the most disagreeable person you can possibly imagine. And it sort of predates the Katniss idea of the YA anti-heroine. So I think that it's just a matter of going back and reading more widely and looking for people who are writing and just not getting the singular narrative that tends to be made. That said, I'm obviously thrilled that we have sort of an acknowledged appetite now for women in the center of narratives. Like, that's always good.
You mentioned female characters that are not always so likable, and actually, when you think about Josephine, is one of those, right? Were you worried about how people would perceive her?
No. She is not a nice person. She is a person who loves very deeply and is doing her best and is smart enough to have done as much as she's done. But the way that she did that was closing herself off emotionally to a lot of the relationships that her younger sisters have with each other that they do not have with her. Like, there's a closeness in sort of the little groupings of younger sisters that she has stepped away from in order to cope with the responsibility that she has put upon herself. That doesn't necessarily make for nice people. I think she is a good person. I just don't think that she's necessarily a nice person. And that's fine. I think that nice is overrated.
Yeah. I think that maybe it's a good idea for girls and women to read about characters who are not nice all the time. And rather, I mean, being good is more important, right? But I don't know if that was a deliberate message or not on your side.
I mean, you definitely, like, there's more of me in Josephine than I can actually come at from sort of an academic standpoint. So I can't be like, when I set out to create Josephine. But in general, I think that a lot of people find writing a strong woman, I always want to do air quotes, writing a strong female character becomes difficult when they are trying to make her infallible. And there is some infallible version of Josephine where she also manages to be emotionally supportive and all of that kind of stuff. And that could be a very interesting story. But there's a lot of value in telling a story about a woman who is worthy of your time, even if she is just a giant human mess. We're getting to see some of that actually in television, and a little bit of it in science fiction television, but specifically there's shows like Fleabag, which came out this year in the US and the UK, and Search Party, which came out this year, both of which center around women who start out with the best of intentions and are sort of terrible people about it. And the show doesn't treat that as a thing that they have to get over. The show treats that as, here is a character, she is a giant human mess. Here is her story. And I think that that's sort of the hurdle that's left to get over, is the idea that you can present a giant mess of a woman and say, here is a giant mess of a woman, here is her story, and not feel like you have to justify the inclusion of her in the narrative. You don't have to. As long as they're interesting, you don't have to.
That sort of leads right to the next question, which is, as
We're
a
nailing this.
novelist,
Okay.
unintentionally. So, as a novelist, how important, in your opinion, is it to have, air quotes, strong female characters, not just in novels, but in pop culture as a whole, on TV or in film?
I think it's important to have interesting female characters. I think falling back on the idea of a strong female character ends up limiting what you feel like you can do. If someone is interesting, it doesn't matter necessarily if they are good or worthy or healthy or helpful. Here is a giant mess of a woman. Here is her story. I think it's definitely important that women be interesting. And I think that that's a big shift that we are seeing now. Fleabag and Search Party, we're getting a lot of anti-heroines in fiction. We have N.K. Jemison's entire 5th season trilogy, where everybody in it is a giant human mess. And it's good to have more of those stories. The idea of a strong female character archetype sort of can run you into a corner. If you try to create interesting people, I think you end up with strong characters sort of by default.
Do you think that portraying this human messes in a way, it kind of shows readers the importance of respecting women as equals and as human beings? Because then when you, like you say, the strong female character archetype, it sort of also puts you in a corner of, well, what if she's not strong? Then is she not worthy of respect? So how do you, yeah.
Yeah, you can end up with sort of the Charles Dickens dichotomy where all of his anti-heroines are actually incredibly interesting people, like incredibly interesting people who were living by their own desires and their own moral codes and everything else. And they're fantastic characters. And Charles Dickens is always a little bit like, and then you get his heroines who are just trod upon, like those poor girls. Every single Charles Dickens heroine is just trod upon. And technically they're strong female characters because they have moral fortitude and they persevere in the face of horrible odds, which is the definition of heroism. But all of his women who have a dark side end up being more interesting, like by default. And I think the idea of respecting a woman because she's more moral, or respecting a woman because she is strong, just ends up being the reverse of the trap of don't respect women because they can't handle something. So I do think that it's sort of important to make space for imperfect women who are still worthy of general human respect.
That kind of brings us to geek culture.
Mm-hmm.
So geek culture in general, including science fiction and fantasy, has had its share of critics that say it's still too male-dominated, despite the fact that there's a rising number of well-respected and well-known female authors. What do you personally think needs to be done to make geek culture as a whole, gaming, comics, or books, more welcoming for women and girls?
I mean, I think the bedrock of it is sort of a trap within the idea of geek culture itself. I think that for a while there was sort of a feeling that geek culture was the underdogs, and it was, Revenge of the Nerds, the kids in the basement playing Dungeons and Dragons because everyone was going to make fun of them. At this point, science fiction, fantasy narratives are the mainstream. I mean, Marvel Studios is one of the highest grossing studios on the planet right now. Like, they have an unbreakable franchise. There was a perception of geek culture as sort of a group of people hanging in there together back when it was sort of a marginalized culture that did not have a hold of culture. But at this point, geek culture is all culture, and trying to turn that into the idea of a small community that's in it together, or a monolith of people that is going to do one thing, I think is counterproductive. For me, I think geek culture is changing because groups of people are finding each other over shared interests without needing to have sort of the same top-down, this is what we are giving you. So in comics, it's no longer just the big two. There's webcomics, there's graphic novels that are being put out in bookstores. There are ways for you to find things that tell you the stories that you want without having to wait and see what happens. What we can do about it is, I don't know, it's above my pay grade. There are a lot of things that can happen. I'd say the thing that you can do is start by finding the things that you love and finding other people who love those things. Wider pushback is going to happen when groups of people have found a thing that they love in what is now the culture. I mean, that's the problem with geek culture. Geek culture is huge now. Game of Thrones is the biggest TV show. Marvel is one of the biggest movie studios. Comic books are being optioned for TV and movies. Science fiction novels are being optioned for TV and movies. All of this is fantastic. but it's sort of like asking the question, what can TV do to be better? And it's like 1,000 things. Like it could be 1,000 different things coming from 1,000 places. What people can do to make geek culture more fulfilling for them is find what they love, make what they love, and hope that the people who need to realize that geek culture is a business and not a group of their best friends do that.
Okay, that's a really interesting perspective. We'll move on from the geek questions to questions about to this question that I have to ask you. So you've been so very incredibly supportive of our Read for Pixels campaign and our anti-violence against women work as a whole. So why do you support the cause to end violence against women?
Oh, I can't believe that question needs to be asked. Okay. I mean, I would hope everyone would be against violence against women. Why I think it's important to talk about is for the same reasons that you were talking about at the beginning of the questions, is the more sunlight we can put on aspects of violence against women that is not what we are knee-jerk taught to think about, means that we're able to sort of create a bigger framework in which to talk about abusive behaviors and how to avoid them without just looking for the guy who is being physically abusive at that moment. I think the more we can talk about what abuse really is, the more we can create support systems for people who are in abusive relationships and need exits, the better everyone's going to be.
In your opinion, how can authors like yourself best support efforts to kick off social change to end violence against women?
To ask the question seriously, if I'm going to have violence against a woman, why is it there? What comes from it? What is the story's reaction to this happening? Because just the act of thinking harder about it is probably going to change the way that you portray it. And changing the way that it's portrayed, I think, is going to change the way that it's thought about in the wider culture.
Thanks so much for answering all our questions. That was the last question, actually.
Okay.
Is there anything that you'd like to say to your fans? Any upcoming conventions or books that are coming out that you'd like to talk about?
I can't talk about any of them yet. So for now, thank you so much to the Pixel Project for having me, and thank you so much to everybody for tuning in.
Okay, thank you so much, Genevieve. I'm going to put myself on, but don't leave yet.
Okay.
Bye, and thank you.
Bye, thank you.
Okay, hi, I'm back again. So as mentioned earlier, Genevieve has also generously donated a few lovely book bundles to the stash of author goodies that we have up as perks for donors at the Read for Pixels fundraising campaign. We have the Persona book bundle, which has one Persona and one Icon hardback, both signed and personalized, and a short story anthology featuring Genevieve's story, also signed and personalized. There are 3 of these. And we have a Genevieve Valentine book bundle with a mechanic, Girls at the Kingfishers Club. Both are paperbacks, signed and personalized, and one Bloody Fabulous anthology of short stories featuring a story from Genevieve alongside stories from Holly Black, Kelly Link, and more. And that's also signed and personalized. So there are 3 of those. And finally, we have the Catwoman comic book bundle. That has 2 Catwoman trade paperbacks, collections number 6 and 7, signed and personalized. 1 Strange Sports Stories from Vertigo, also signed and personalized. We only have 1 of those. And they're only available for donors in the US. How sad. We've crossed the $4,000 milestone and are on our way to our $5,000 fundraising goal. So there are also plenty more author goodies available from authors including Adrian Tchaikovsky, Charles DeLint, Kendra Blake, Karen Rose, Vicky Peterson, and more. So I'm going to share a slide with more information about where people can donate. So please give generously to help us reach our goals. All our funds go towards the Pixel Project's male, celebrity male role model Pixel Reveal campaign to help end violence against women. So you can donate to get the goodies that I mentioned on RallyUp at is.gd/r4p RallyUp 2017. If you want to learn more about Read for Pixels, go to is.gd/Read for Pixels. To find out more about violence against women and what you can do about it, visit the Pixel Project's website at www.thepixelproject.net. And once again, to find out more about the celebrity male role model Pixel Reveal campaign, please visit reveal.thepixelproject.net. And please do donate generously to help us reveal pixels and raise the $1 million for the cause. So thank you and have a good day or a good night wherever you are. Bye. Bye, everyone.